Meta. Are we awake today? Good morning.
Good morning.
I know we all stayed up till midnight last night. No, I did. Today is the feast of St. Luke. And St. Luke was probably the most intelligent of all the followers of Christ. He was a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a writer, and a speaker, and a leader. So God takes all kinds of people. We have everything from the illiterate fisherman to the very literate St. Luke. And St. Luke wrote the Gospel of St. Luke, and he also wrote the book of Acts. So there's two books of the Bible attributed to him. And St. Luke also painted the first known icon, which is of the Virgin Mary, which is in the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai, and remains covered because he painted her portrait, basically. We know that the saints are likenesses of the holy people they depict, but he painted the Virgin Mary actually what she looked like. Not close, but exactly what she looked like. The epistle lesson, there is a normal order of readings on Sundays. And there's we're in the season of Luke, the first week, the second week, the third week of Luke. And because today is a big feast day of St. Luke, we skip the gospel in the order that it would have fallen, and we read an epistle and a gospel for this feast of St. Luke. And the epistle from the Colossians is chosen because it mentions Luke by name, Luke, the beloved physician, one of the people who St. Paul is passing on their greetings. And the gospel reading was chosen because it mentions the 70. And St. Luke was part of a group called the 70 Apostles. We know the 12 apostles. They're on the walls of our church. Many of us know them by name. But there was a second grouping of apostles called the 70. And St. Luke was part of this group, the 70, which is why we read this gospel lesson. So there's some important things in the epistle lesson today and in the gospel that I want to share with you. The first is in the first verse of the epistle. St. Paul gives out 3 pieces of really good advice. Conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders. Conduct ourselves wisely is always a good idea, especially with people we don't know, because there are lots of people who want to take what we're doing and maybe twist it around. So conduct yourselves wisely all the time. Advice number 2, make the most of the time. Make the most of the time. This is really kind of in line with what we talked about last week, the parable of the sower. Sowing the seed. Getting the best of what you can out of what you've been given. For those who have been here for many years, you know about 3.5 years ago or so, I had sinus surgery. And I missed a couple weeks, and I was laid up in the house doing much of nothing. And they told me, before you have the surgery, plan on doing nothing for a couple weeks. You're not going to feel good, you're going to be dizzy and nauseous, and of course I didn't believe them because I'm like a workaholic, I never want to stop. But I said, all right, I'll prepare myself just in case they're right. In fact, the doctor even said, get all the videos out that you want to watch, because you won't even have the energy to dig in the cupboard to get the videos out. I said, all right, I'll do that. I had a stack of reading, a stack of videos, and a reclining chair, and they were right. Couldn't do anything for 2 weeks other than lay on the recliner and watch movies and read, and I didn't even feel like reading. But I made the most out of that time. I could have done other things. I could have watched bad movies. I could have called up people and gossiped with them. But I made the most of the time, and that time, the best I could do was just to relax and recover. So there's a lesson there. Make the most out of what you have. Make the most out of what you have. We're not all going to be physicians like St. Luke or lawyers or artists, but can you make the most out of what you have? Can you make the most out of what you have? The third piece of advice is let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. So salt is both an additive and a preservative. Salt adds flavor to food, but it's also a preservative to keep food fresh. So our speech should be additive and preservative at the same time. Our speech should add to the conversation, should add to relationships, should add to friendships, as well as preserving our relationships and our friendships. If we are going to season our speech with other things that are not tasty, we're going to poison our relationships and our friendships. The third and perhaps the most important part of this epistle, after this, the mention of St. Luke and the 3 pieces of advice, is how Paul signs the end of it. Remember my fetters, grace be with you. So Paul wrote this letter while he was in prison. And he goes right from saying, remember that I'm in prison, to grace be with you. He doesn't say, remember I'm in prison and I'm kind of angry about it. Or remember I'm in prison, come and break me out. Remember that I'm in prison and may God's grace still continue to be on you. I may be in a bad spot, but I hope you're in a good spot. And it's really interesting that St. Paul sort of suffers the ultimate quarantine. Like we're all stuck in our houses and we have to do things differently. We have to run our companies and our businesses and our schools. We've had to do that from home. We've had to be students from home. And St. Paul is trying to administer the entire church of that part of the world, which of course the church is fledgling. It's just a couple years old. St. Paul is trying to administer all of this from prison. And he does it with grace, and he does it with joy, and he does it with enthusiasm, despite the fact that he's being kept in jail under threat of execution and without a hope of it ending. He still finds joy in what he's doing. And so we're kind of in the same way. I don't think we're living under threat of execution, at least not yet, I hope. But we all live under threat of what's going to happen next, and how long is the quarantine going to last, and what's it going to look like on the other end. And we have to go through this time the way St. Paul did, with some joy, with some enthusiasm, and with some purpose, making the most out of the time. In the gospel lesson, which I'll reference only briefly, as I said, this gospel was chosen because it mentions the 70 returned with joy. Many people look at this like, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Like, let's get excited about that. And Jesus tells the disciples who now have all strengths and powers to heal people, he says, don't get a big head about that. Satan had power at one time. He was one of God's chosen angels, and he fell like lightning. So if God is blessing you or blessing us, let's not let it go to our heads. Let's continue to be humble so that we don't fall like lightning, like Satan. And Jesus says, don't rejoice in all of your accomplishments, disciples, who, we can cast out spirits, we can tread on serpents, we have the power over all the enemy. And Jesus says, those are good things, but don't get a big head about those things. Rejoice rather that your names are written in heaven. And that's his message to us. You have accomplishments, you have talents, make the most of them, be humble about them. But the thing that you want to rejoice in the most is not your accomplishments or your bank account or your friendships, but that your names are written in heaven. And so as we find ourselves, and it's so wonderful to see so many people today, and we welcome, of course, our online congregation, remember these things. Make the most of the time. Let our speech be gracious. Let's not let our accomplishments go to our heads, but be humble about them. Rejoice that our names are written in God's book in heaven. And remember this time of quarantine to make the most of what we're doing and to be as positive as we can. I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again a few times. I know that this is really hard. I know this is really hard. Every day, it seems that the phone rings in the office with someone that's having a hard time. I totally get that. I have a hard time at times. There are times where I call friends, and I'm like, I'm sick and tired of this. And there are times where I don't want to call my friends, and I want to call my spiritual father. I want to call someone who can pray for me, who can encourage me in a spiritual way. And so I encourage you all, if you're having a hard time and you need some prayer or some encouragement, phone. Call Charlie, call Alex. Stop by the office if you want. Just call us first. And let's talk about it. We know it's a hard time, but we know that the time is easier to pass when we're passing it with other people who care about us. We have given our lives for this because we care about you, and probably never has it been more important in our ministry, in our history of our church, that we are pastorally sensitive and pastorally involved with those who are struggling. So if you are, don't despair. Don't think I'm the only one that's having a hard time. Let's talk about it so we can strengthen one another through prayer. And thank you for being here today, because we are all strengthened when we stand together and we worship.